Hello, everyone. My name is Courtney Walton Mitchell, and I'm a research associate at the Natural Hazards Center at the University of Colorado Boulder. I really appreciate you logging on today to the webinar, and we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm also fortunate to administer the recently launched Mitigation Matters Research Program at the center. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the monthly Making Mitigation Work webinar series, which is hosted by the Natural Hazards Center and made possible with the support of the Federal Emergency Management Agency and Natural Science Foundation. This webinar series highlights recent progress in mitigation policy, practice, and research. We are so grateful that you've joined us today for this webinar session on climate change research from 3 of our Mitigation Matters Awards recipients. They will share research focused on household adaptation, impacts of climate-induced coral bleaching on community well-being and hazards vulnerability, and use of traditional knowledge in response to sea level rise. Again, thank you so much for being here. Before we begin, I have a few announcements. The forum is being recorded, and the captioned video recording and presentation slides from today's webinar will be posted online at the Natural Hazards Center website. That's hazards.colorado.edu. This is also where you can find the recordings and supplemental materials from the prior Making Mitigation Work webinars, as well as access to many other free resources. Thanks to a partnership with the International Association of Emergency Managers, we can offer 1 contact hour of emergency management training through the IAEM certification program. To receive the credit, you're required to attend the entire webinar session today. So please visit the Making Mitigation Work webpage under the Training tab at hazards.colorado.edu for more information. You can also contact Katie Murphy at hazcenter@colorado.edu. That's HAZCTR@colorado.edu for more information on receiving your certificate for attending the webinar today. So I wanted to just let you know that we're going to have 3 15-minute presentations. And given that, we're going to ask that you save your questions until the end of the presentations when we'll open up the Q&A session. At that time, we'll pull questions from both the chat and the Q&A boxes. And now, without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our speakers who were all part of the inaugural cohort of recipients for the Mitigation Matters Research Awards. So today you'll hear from first, Brianna Castro of Harvard University, presenting on the intersection of mitigation measures and household adaptation to climate change. Next, you'll hear from Kelly Dunning of Auburn University, presenting on how climate-induced coral bleaching impacts community well-being and hazard vulnerability. Please note, Kelly's presentation has been recorded due to a schedule conflict. And then finally, Nicole Hutton of Old Dominion University, presenting on the traditional ecological knowledge and mitigation nexus, the Pamunkey Indian Reservation. So before we begin our first presentation, I wanted to encourage you to visit our Natural Hazards Center website to read each of the speakers' bios on the webpage. Also, under the awards tab, you can access more information about the Mitigation Matters program, and you can read the full research reports and review the research briefs from our speakers today. So here you can see how you can access on our website the research reports and the research briefs. Again, I want to thank Brianna, Kelly, and Nicole for sharing their time and insights with us both through the webinar and through these written reports and briefs. Over to you, Brianna.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Courtney. I'm excited to be here with all of you today and to talk about my research funded by the Natural Hazards Center through FEMA and the National Science Foundation through the Mitigation Matters program. I'm going to go over the highlights of my project in this presentation, and I look forward to answering any questions that you have after all 3 presentations. So my project is on household level adaptation to climate change in coastal North Carolina. There is quite a bit of existing research looking at adaptations broadly, as well as in North Carolina specifically, and that finds that institutional adaptations like seawalls, beach nourishment, they disproportionately protect wealthier communities, and buyouts and relocations are more commonly found in lower income communities with higher racial diversity. But we don't know very much about what homeowners are doing to adapt without comprehensive mitigation or adaptation by local or federal institutions. Climate hazards are on the rise, and the adaptations and mitigations that we have haven't quite caught up with the level of hazards that coastal communities are experiencing right now, in my experience. So to learn more about how homeowners are responding to climate hazards, I collected ethnographic and interviewed data with homeowners over 8 months, from July of 2020 through last month. And this includes interviews with 50 homeowners, 15 interviews with key informants, and lots of ethnographic time and field notes. So I interviewed people about climate impacts they're experiencing, their daily lives, what they know about mitigation efforts, and how they're managing and coping on the day-to-day. So I'll start with climate impacts in coastal North Carolina. This is in inland North Carolina on the Inner Banks, but bordering the Sound. And you see we have chronic flooding there, and actually flooding on the Inner Banks region is it's a little bit more flood prone even than the Outer Banks. And there's also flooding here taken from Hatteras Island on the Outer Banks. This was a non-event on Hatteras Island, which is common. It's salt water that overwashed the dunes, floods the highway, makes them impassable. I'm intentionally showing photos here of chronic flooding rather than extreme storms, because we often focus on those hurricanes and extreme storm events, which are devastating, but residents are dealing with chronic flooding, nuisance flooding, saltwater inundation, heavier rainfall, just to name a few, on a regular basis. This map here is from a study of adaptation measures in coastal North Carolina specifically, and the shaded gray areas show you the floodplains, and then circles and little umbrellas show you institutional adaptations in my area of research. So I just like to point out two things here. First, the area where I'm interviewing homeowners are on the Outer Banks chain of islands that you see on the far right, and then on the inland peninsula just across the Sound from that chain, that's shaded in dark gray with 75% or higher of A-zone floodplain designation. You can also see by the darker shading on the Inner Banks Peninsula that the flood risk is higher there than it is in some of the beachfront communities along the Outer Banks. The adaptation measures that you find in this area are primarily beach nourishment. There is some property acquisition, though not much. And then there's shoreline armoring on the Sound side of the Outer Banks Island. And it's important to note that currently neither county in my research area is participating in any federally funded buyout programs. So what I'm going to talk about today are what I call ad hoc adaptations. And these are actions homeowners are taking on their own to deal with climate hazards impacting their daily lives. Some do so acknowledging climate change, while others don't talk about climate change at all. But in both cases, people are recognizing hazards and adapting their homes and property. The ad hoc adaptations I found are pervasive. I'm not going to tell you about changes to homes that I saw once or twice, but I'm seeing them throughout communities, and people discuss these as obvious things you know to do if you live in these areas. They're not forward thinking. And I'd like to make sure to note that I'm not talking about homes like this. Second homes, beachfront properties, and investment properties are not the focus of this research. I'm focusing on year-round long-term residents on the Outer Banks and Inner Banks, and even on the Outer Banks. Most long-term or year-round residents don't live on the ocean front, they live on the Sound side of the island. I'm also not talking about renters. I focused on homeowners for this pilot project. And if you're on the home market, this one here is for sale. It's dropped to $479,000 now. While the overall market on the Outer Banks has been booming during COVID, there are very specific stretches of the coast, such as this one, where the erosion is really high, where values are dropping. This home would have been $1 million probably, were it not for the erosion. Okay, so let's get into the adaptations. First, I'm going to talk about what I'm seeing in among homeowners who are experiencing rainfall and tidal flooding. You can see in this photo, the home is elevated quite high. And these home elevations are done independently. They're done because people recognize the flooding risk and choose to build their own homes higher. They're not done post-storm. You also see homeowners changing the construction materials or choosing specific construction materials that are weather resistant. For example, on the top half of this house here, you could see cedar shake siding, which is extremely water resistant, wind tolerant. You can also see cinder block on the bottom, which can get wet and dry out differently than wood. Folks are ripping out fiberglass insulation from under their homes and replacing it with foam board insulation, because that can get wet without causing mold. HVAC units are being elevated. People build platforms on the first floor of their property to elevate their washer and dryer, their water heater, any appliances or property that they keep closer to the ground level. Another thing that's very completely common is adding fill to property, buying dump truck loads of mulch, wood chips, sand, any fill that you can get, and spreading it out across the land around your house to keep water from pooling around the house or on the property or around the septic tank. Homeowners are also raising septic tanks in septic fields, and many homeowners purchase sump pumps and they use those to remove water from their property when it's standing. So they'll get a long hose and a pump and pump it off their yards. And then home generators are, of course, extremely common. Other adaptations for hurricanes and for wind are more common on the Outer Banks. Those include hurricane roof straps, which is a specific structure built into the roof of the house to make it more wind resistant, changing windows for high impact windows, using post and beam construction, which is a traditional method of construction in this area that is more wind tolerant, choosing thick framing posts for high winds, such as a 6x6 or 4x4 framing. Again, the cedar shake siding, wind resistant shingles or roof paneling. You can see on this house that they took off the shingles and replaced it with big pieces of paneling that hold up better in hurricanes. Also home generators and using paneling on the inside walls of the house instead of drywall, which is more damaged by water. Many individuals on the Outer Banks, specifically Hatteras Island, built their homes themselves in the 70s. That's not uncommon, and they made these choices when they built or adapted the homes later. Others have their homes built by builders and add these things in. Building code is very good on the Outer Banks compared to the Inner Banks, but people intentionally build beyond code because they know about the climate hazards that they're dealing with. Other adaptations that are more interesting, a little bit less common, are adding marsh grass or oyster beds to the property to kind of reduce erosion on the sound side of the island. Businesses on the ocean front and property owners on the sound side sandbag their property to keep that water from coming up towards their house. And many residents purchase backhoes or other large construction equipment to be able to clear debris or clear sand during overwash events on the Outer Banks. One gentleman told me, "I'm everyone's best friend when there's overwash," because he owned a backhoe. Really interesting on the inland side of the sound is ad hoc floodplain management. This is a largely agricultural area that's very, very low and very, very flood prone. And so water management in an ad hoc way is super common. So what do I mean by that? On the left side of this image, you'll see a large pump that's pumping water through a canal. And on the right side, you'll see a canal that's been created, a ditched and drained, and a tidal gate mechanism that's been dammed by a beaver. And so farmers throughout the area purchase large pumps, they create canals, they ditch and they drain, all through private funding and through cooperation among farmers associations to manage floodwater throughout this territory. This network of ditching, draining pumps and gates keeps water from standing on farmland and also keeps water from standing around people's homes throughout the area. This isn't managed by the county. There's no institutional system for it. This is all independent. The only problem is that when the sound is high, which is more and more common, the canals don't drain into the sound and salt water comes up through the canals and seeps into fields and floods homes. I find this level of unregulated, privately funded adaptation to manage water to be surprising, and homeowners are completely relying on this to keep floodwater off their own properties in the region. So the floodgate there that's been dammed by beavers is really interesting. Beavers and nutria and otters like to hang out in the canals and sometimes block up the tide gates or mess up the pumps, and so trappers are hired to remove animals and remove dams. Another thing that I found that's a method of adapting is just letting go. Residents retreat from pieces of property in big and small ways in this region. The extreme of that is abandoning a home or moving elsewhere because of the flooding and climate hazards, but it's also very small decisions. Some people leave who have enough resources to do so, and other people leave because they don't have enough resources to manage the climate hazards. So for example, this property someone owns but have stopped using. And that's one thing that I see often. They don't build on it anymore. They've stopped filling it. It's private property, but the water is rising over it, submerging it, and it's just out of use. Homeowners also who have damaged property such as docks or things on the water side build them back closer to the shoreline because of the hazards. And that's a way of just pulling back away from the rising water. Here you see fields. This edge of the field, I think you can see my mouse, that's sandy and not planted. Farmers have stopped planting borders of fields where they know that saltwater inundation creates less growth. So they back away from those borders of the fields that are closer to the canals and the ditches. They also take fields that are unproductive due to saltwater inundation out of production, sometimes putting them into wetland restoration programs. And then you see homes like this where ad hoc adaptation really isn't taking place or is minimal. So the house kind of goes into less and less repair and then is abandoned or sold. I think this house sold for $22,000. Wasn't weatherized. So an unusual number of abandoned homes are present throughout the Inner Banks area, and many have been damaged through water or storms and not repaired afterwards. And so some turn up for sale, others are sold privately without going on market at prices I found ranging from $5,000 to $30,000. And from this preliminary research, homeowners move away from homes like this inland one county over to the Washington area of North Carolina. So it's about an hour away, still vulnerable to flooding, but much less so, and crossing a county line. In interviews with former residents that left Hyde County, where I was studying inland, and moved over to Washington, they cited struggling to get FEMA assistance after hurricanes, not qualifying for assistance to elevate their homes, and ultimately deciding to move. And I would want to do more research on this, but thus far those residents were more often African American and low income. I also saw really interesting findings in terms of risk tolerance. Many residents that I interviewed don't feel that flooding is a problem. To them, a flood would be many, many feet of water, 6 feet of water, 7 feet of water, 8 feet of water, and not the chronic standing water or 1 foot of chronic nuisance flooding they see all the time in the institutions or floodplain designations know as flooding. So it's interesting that institutions and local homeowners seem to use flooding with different meanings. So also, residents that I interviewed who are adapting their home, for example, at one house, I entered wearing knee-high waders going through water, and inside the homeowners told me that they didn't have a problem with flooding and they hadn't had a flood in a long time. And when I asked them about the water in the yard, they said, well, that's not flooding, that's just normal around here. So that's an example of perception. Also, homeowners who are adapting their homes in this way are doing as many things that they can to no longer carry flood insurance, even though they live in the floodplain. They explain that they don't need the flood insurance, that their homes can handle the water, that their homes can handle a hurricane. If they've elevated, they say, I no longer need it. It won't cover anything anyway because my home is elevated. I saw farmers taking out farm loans to pay for their homes instead of mortgages because they don't have to take out homeowners insurance or flood insurance on a farm loan. There are a variety of tactics, but a general perception that flood insurance is something to avoid among long-term residents in this coastal region, which I think is important and warrants more research. So I think my big findings and takeaways from this preliminary research is that there's misalignments and therefore opportunities for better alignment and institutional actions to manage climate hazards and homeowners ad hoc adaptations. Things like beach nourishment protect those oceanfront second home properties, but do less for long-term residents on the inner and outer banks of coastal North Carolina. The mitigation measures are outpaced, and our policies tend to focus on hurricanes, extreme events, and disaster recovery, but we don't have quite enough for chronic nuisance, increasing climate hazards that are wearing people down and costing people money. So I would suggest, or I think we need more research on mitigation measures that could target these slow and repetitive climate change impacts and support homeowner adaptations that are working now. And I have a few notes on future research, and this is preliminary, specifically looking at flood insurance take-up with the upcoming rate hikes, understandings in a deep way of disaster recovery assistance, talking to renters and immigrant communities. Some of those things were difficult in a COVID climate. And then that is it. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brianna. What I'm going to do is just go ahead and I'll be sharing, let me just pull this up here, Kelly Dunning's presentation. And I see we've got some great questions coming in for Brianna. And if you don't mind holding your questions until the end, but if you do want to go ahead and drop your questions in the Q&A or the chat, we'll certainly pick those up at the end for the Q&A session.
Hello, my name is Kelly Dunning, and I am presenting my Mitigation Matters presentation centering community voices to mitigate hazards. Hello, my name is Dr. Kelly Dunning. I'm sorry I can't be here today. I'm out of town for a family obligation, but I would love it if you got in touch with me. My email and my social media is at the bottom of the screen here. I am a newish assistant professor at Auburn University School of Forestry and Wildlife. My research program at Auburn is really focused on community-based natural resource management, especially community-based coral reef management. I have a book on the subject that I wrote in 2018, and the Mitigation Matters program has enabled me to kind of take the next logical steps and continue building this research program. So I want to thank everybody working on that program for funding this research, because you've really kind of allowed me to take the next steps in this area. I want to pause to acknowledge that Auburn University sits on the land of the Poarch Creek Indigenous community. We remember their connection to this region and thank them for the opportunity to live, work, learn on their traditional homeland. So I kind of want to turn a conventional presentation on its head. I want to start off with my policy implications, and I want to quickly bring in a tiny case study given the short amount of time I'm going to be talking today. So in 2019, the Cayman Islands government moved ahead with a major port expansion project that would increase cruise traffic and economic growth, but it would also cause irreversible harm to some of the most iconic coral reefs in the Caribbean. If you've ever been to Devil's Grotto, that's a beautiful picture of what it looks like. These amazing grottos and these tiny little silverfish aggregate there in the summer months, and you can go and swim through them. It's absolutely amazing. And the fact that the Cayman Islands government were going forward with this port expansion was really remarkable, because there are actually really strong legal protections and existing international framework agreements to protect reefs in the Cayman Islands. This environmental dispute, it actually went on to result in the first ever people's referendum on coral reef conservation as to whether or not the Cayman Islands government had the authority to implement this project and damage these really well-loved, absolutely iconic reefs in Georgetown Harbor. So I started thinking about these questions. Why do countries, especially countries known for good governance, like, a lot of people trust the Cayman Islands with a lot of money. So why do countries seek to violate their own laws? And my hypothesis is policy trade-offs, in other words, who are the winners and who are the losers, are not evaluated and compared to each other in ways that makes the winners and the losers clear and transparent. And when I say winners and losers, I'm being somewhat facetious, but the winners in this Cayman Islands case would be the private multinational cruise companies, and those who stand to lose a lot are coastal Caymanians. And what exactly would they be losing? Well, I want to talk a little bit about the damage that climate change is causing to global coral reef ecosystems, and it's doing so, it's causing changes in ways that are increasingly seeming to be irreversible. And how so? Well, warming oceans are causing coral bleaching. Sea level rise is causing increased sedimentation and smothering of coral reefs. Stronger storms are damaging our coral reefs, and changes in precipitation are causing more runoff and linked algal blooms. This is a really urgent problem because coral reefs are immensely valuable to people all over the world. Here in the United States, they provide $3.4 billion in fisheries, tourism, and coastal protection services annually, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And despite bearing the impacts of climate change, reefs also protect vulnerable coastal communities from these very same climate hazards. This is a dynamic that, in my view, really illustrates the urgency and importance of coral reef conservation. So take, for example, the fact that coral reefs prevent $94 million in annual coastal flood damage protection. So with coral reefs facing unprecedented threats to their survival from the climate crisis, coastal communities are going to need to adapt to this new climate reality, and decision makers are going to have to act in innovative ways to really deal with these hazards. So what I was able to do through the Mitigation Matters program was start to study how conservation policies such as protected areas for coral reefs, how these policies fall into what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, classifies as low regrets policies because of their simultaneous ability to preserve these ecosystem services that are so important to human communities and build resilience to current and future climate hazards. So moving on to my research that I was able to do through this funding, all public policy requires that we make trade-offs, as in furthering protections for coral reefs may limit some economic activities in a given spatial area. Think back to the mini case, and the trade-offs there were between multinational cruise companies, economic development, and preserving some natural heritage of the islands. The Mitigation Matters program allowed me to start asking about how we actually evaluate these different trade-offs. Do we do it in a systematic way? How are experts valuing coral reefs? And I adopted an ecosystem services framework for my research, which attempts to quantify a wide range of values for the different ecosystem services that reefs are providing us. And the thinking behind some of the most important ecosystem services research is placing these economic values on ecosystems will make policy trade-offs more easy to make for decision makers. So through this project, I really honed in on these major port dredging projects, like the one that I mentioned in the Caymans, but another one in South Florida, where I'm from, in the Port of Miami, where these dredging damages to coral reefs are being permitted to kind of expand this port infrastructure for major cargo and tourism, and who's kind of losing out from these trade-offs and who stands to gain quite a bit. I use this funding to kind of systematically look at how we evaluate these trade-offs, as in whose voices really matter when we assign value to the ecological damages that these types of projects create, and who is accruing benefits, who's losing out when valuable coastal protection services are lost, and so on and so forth. My findings, I reviewed the coral reef literature. Specifically, I looked at 109 valuations of coral reef ecosystems from 42 different studies in the past 30 years, and I coded all of these studies based on when they were done and whether they spoke to diverse stakeholders in these impacted communities, whether the values were aggregates or as a result of kind of like a structured conversation, and a couple other variables. And I found that 99% of these studies actually aggregated values from individuals, which I found that to be interesting because it got me wondering, is this really the way that humans place value on things? Or rather, do community groups assign value and prioritize things as a kind of group-wide collective action, which in turn led me to the deliberative valuation literature, which is relatively new. It's not very new, but it's relatively new. And it asks stakeholders, instead of assigning values as an aggregated collection of individuals, to instead make decisions in groups to kind of better approximate how we make decisions in real life. And findings from the handful of deliberative valuation papers that I looked at showed people are actually more likely to make collectively beneficial decisions in a deliberative setting compared to when they're asked to assign values solo. So one of the big findings that came up here was just over half of the studies that I coded looked at or centered the voices of the communities that depend on coral reefs very strongly and intimately for their livelihoods. This was kind of alarming to me because instead of all of these studies looking at the voices of community groups and stakeholders, often what was used to create these valuations were the valuations of foreign tourists coming from wealthier countries in the global north. So what does this all mean? In my view, and according to my research, which, like I said, only half the time centers the voices of coral reef dependent communities, I think that we should completely change the way that we evaluate policy trade-offs. We have to be more transparent about who is actually losing out and giving up some of these ecosystem services, and what exactly is it that they stand to lose, and who is winning, and what benefits will these winners accrue? Are they private actors based in completely different countries? What happens if some of these damages, like I mentioned in the Cayman Islands case, what if they're irreversible? What we need is a more collaborative form of assigning values and evaluating trade-offs. And I think that these are available to us as deliberative valuation methods, mainly because they're more fair and they're more transparent. So I'm going to end it here. I know that that was really, really quick. I would love for you to get in touch with me here or over Twitter. And if you have any questions for me, I would love to answer them over email, and I apologize that I'm not here to answer them today, but I hope that you'll get in touch with me, and I hope that you enjoyed this presentation, and I would like to thank Mitigation Matters one last time for funding what I think is some really cool research that's going to bring me in some pretty interesting directions over the next couple years. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Great. So I'm so grateful that Kelly was able to provide a pre-recorded presentation. And as she mentioned, we are happy to take questions for Kelly, and we will make sure that we get those questions to her and that we do post the answers on our website. And now I'll turn it over to Nicole.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. Today I'm going to be talking about my presentation on the nexus between traditional ecological knowledge and sea level rise. And this is a study that I have actually been trying to get going for a couple of years with the Pamunkey Indian tribe. And the feedback we were getting from other funders was, well, you have to do a feasibility study first. And so this Mitigation Matters grant actually allowed us to get that started so that we would have something to build from. So I'm very appreciative of that. So today I'm presenting this to you as a story map, and I'm just going to guide you through what I have here. After I go over our main objectives and a little bit of the methods, I'm going to show you a series of visualizations and quotes from the participants, and those are going to be up on the screen while I give you a little bit more information from the rest of the report, but that way you have something visually appealing to look at while I talk to you. All right, so our objectives here were threefold. We wanted to temporally assess how sea level rise has and will alter the Pamunkey Indian tribe's relationship with the river that they live on. So to give you some context, they're on a tributary to the York River, which feeds into the Chesapeake Bay. And their reservation is about a 1,000 acre peninsula that actually sticks out into the river. So after we figured out over time how this relationship has changed, we wanted to actually spatially reference some of the priorities that the traditional ecological knowledge holders had. And then finally, we wanted to actually identify the role of traditional knowledge in flood management. And I want to note there that we did drop the word ecological from traditional ecological knowledge for the purposes of this study at the advice of the tribal liaison that we were working with. She said that term just didn't really resonate. And since she was involved in our survey development, we moved forward with a term that seemed to work better for the participants. So our participants were involved in a survey, because this was conducted last July through September. And so COVID measures from both ODU and restrictions to accessing the reservation itself prevented us from doing some of the in-person methods that we would have been doing. But gratefully, we had actually 9 to 10, depending on which part of the survey you look at, of the 15 tribal members who held traditional knowledge about the river itself involved in the study. So their participation is greatly appreciated. All right, so I'll start here. And what you're seeing in terms of the quotes on this particular side is where it would have been an oral history. These were in fact collected over the phone instead of in person. But essentially these quotes talk about the participants' interest in future mitigation efforts and the experiences with sea level rise that they've had. And the visual that I have off to the side here shows the railroad tracks that actually lead to the reservation. Interestingly enough, this is the highest access point in and out of the reservation, and that'll come up later as a concern of the tribes because this is in fact a privately held railroad. All right, so sea level rise has reduced the land area of the reservation and altered the way the tribe interacts with the shoreline. Erosion has reduced fish stocks and limited the fishing culture. Some participants recounted seeing changes in the low tide line, increased marsh, fallen survey poles from the 1960s, and reduced yards along the river. And those were their personal experiences. In fact, a young woman who drove me through the reservation before COVID lockdowns were in place explained to me that even within her lifetime, which was about the same length as mine, that she had seen these changes. And so this very much stands out in the recent memory of the participants from this tribe. So in terms of recent mitigation efforts, these included living shorelines, a bulkhead, and riprap. There is some disagreement amongst the participants regarding whether or not previous generations thought about adaptation and mitigation, but irrigation ditches were installed between the farms hundreds of years ago. And there were other trapping practices that may have contributed to reduced erosion. Despite these intergenerational efforts and effects, some participants still lamented that more should have been done. A participant actually proposed that protection should have been extended to the whole shoreline, and another agreed that holding the existing shoreline was just not enough. Traditional knowledge holders expected that the flooding would get worse. It would restrict roadway use, and it would cause additional erosion and damage homes in the future. It is, however, important to preserve values and traditions when selecting mitigation options, even if modern solutions are selected to protect other relevant resources. And some of those resources that they want to protect that are traditional include clay and fish. And so you'll see how that plays out on our next image here. Scroll down. All right, so next to this image, you see some quotes that provide more of the cultural pros and cons for mitigation. And the visual itself actually shows a demolished fishing hut and the bulkhead that's holding back the erosion from under the other fishing huts. And that fishing hut demolition is seen to be one of the biggest mistakes in terms of how mitigation has been handled so far. So the different participants wanted either the bulkhead or the living shoreline to extend around the reservation. This hasn't been done so far because it cost to the tune of about $1 million, and they haven't leveraged the funds to do that yet. They proposed focusing on recently eroded areas, homes, roads, graves, sacred sites, historic structures, wetlands, or the road in and out of the reservation. The recommendations ranged from walls that stop 1 to 2 feet of flooding experienced today to structures capable of preventing it for generations to come. Gray infrastructure was actually suggested more often than green options. The preferences were also expressed for native plants over other plants that were used in the existing living shorelines, and bulkheads over rocks or structural protections. Raising houses, dredging, and wetland restoration were all recommended as well. Land use change in favor of organic farming and restoring traditional beaver and muskrat hunting practices were proposed by a couple of participants. One participant requested additional education on the effects of projects installed in the last 10 years and potential future options. And I just want to highlight one of the pieces at the bottom here that you hadn't been seeing while I was talking. One of the sites at risk is Powhatan's burial ground. And the reason that one of the participants mentioned this is they thought that this was a cultural connection that would resonate farther outside of the actual reservation itself, because that's a piece of history that is more widely known than perhaps the fishing contributions and cultures that are noted in some of the Middle Peninsula Planning District pieces of literature, but are not widely known outside of the area. All right. So we did, after we collected this history, we engaged the participants in a web app process where they actually put points and lines and polygons on a map to show which areas they wanted to be protected, to have some sort of mitigation structures added to make sure that they were not affected as quickly by the sea level rise. And so the quotes that I have next to this image are their reactions to seeing the map. So the map that we showed them didn't have these lovely green lines. That's what they put in. And they also put the gray dots in themselves. But it did show sea level rise for 2040, 2060, and 2080. And this is the future sea level and recurrent flooding risk for coastal Virginia map that was developed by Old Dominion University's Commonwealth Center for Recurrent Flood Resiliency. So that's where we got that from and what we showed them. And they did also see reference points for where there were cemeteries and residences and ceremonial grounds. We removed those from the final product because those were privately held layers that the tribe allowed us to use only for their viewing purposes. So that's what they were looking at when they selected these features. All right, so when they viewed these maps, it shifted the participants' focus onto people's homes or old ceremony grounds. Some participants stated that dates in the map helped them realize the extent of the problem and the need to work faster to address it. The map led one participant to question whether or not a bulkhead would be able to stop the flooding. Most participants suggested strategies that addressed vulnerabilities through structural mitigation, such as constructing bulkheads, floodgates, levees, and pump stations, or elevating roads, structures, and shorelines. Some strategies relied upon ecological functions to reduce flooding, such as introducing strategic vegetation and protecting wetlands. Participants' recommendations were still not without hesitation over how modifications could have unintended effects. One participant expressed concern that extensive structural mitigation would shift water flow elsewhere and cause ecological damage there. Another noted that activities like dredging and anything that regarded wildlife would need to be timed accordingly to not interfere with natural breeding patterns. Participants called for the inclusion of additional information in future map iterations to help advocate, including storm surge, current sea levels, elevation and depth data, projected erosion, areas with the potential for uninhabitable marshland and wetland development, previously held territory, and simulations of what can stop the flooding. So perhaps in viewing this yourself, you can see some of their concerns where the different shades of blue change from what's going to be flooded in 2040 to 2060 to 2080. It's a little hard to see. And they were either working online or with an 11 by 17 inch map. So I can see some of their concerns there. All right, so more information, internal communication, and external advocacy about flood risk and mitigation technology were desired in the form of not only maps, but also blueprints, trainings, and impact assessments. All right, so these quotes show what the participants were thinking in terms of planning all of these different mitigation efforts for the future in light of seeing the sea level rise map. And next to this, I have a visual of one of the living shoreline installations. This is actually in front of Powhatan's grave and is part of that $1 million project that they hope to expand to protect the full reservation. Participants suggested developing a flood control plan to balance these strategies. Participants identified several challenges unique to the reservation. Internally, residence locations and governance were a concern. Land is not distributed in a way that protects new residents or protects existing residents from flood risk. Some recent residents experienced flooded fields shortly after arrival. Without the support of the chief and council, community priorities cannot progress externally either. As administrations change, even on the tribal council, the willingness to promote mitigation and adaptation efforts also change. Externally, a privately held railroad that may carry toxic cargo crosses the reservation, and river pollution from upstream affects the reservation. Flooding around the railroad tracks has caused destabilization before that could result in derailment. The sheriff must be called to temporarily block the tracks until the railroad company can re-stabilize it. Runoff was another perceived external threat. The runoff from the county dump and the farming chemicals pollute the river, and the reservation residents receive the highest levels of pollution due to proximity. Negotiations with individual landholders and the municipality would be required to reduce pollution. All right, so here, I'm not actually showing you the quotes anymore. I'm showing you this last set of priorities that they actually came up with. And there's a visual right next to it of the riprap installation to protect one of the homes on the shoreline. So just to conclude here, the traditional knowledge can inform the priorities for extent, elements, and location of mitigation and adaptation. Once the expectations are set, action to protect, preserve, and relocate culturally and economically valuable assets can begin. Timelines for implementation must be adjusted to create change before sea level rise prevents access. Opportunities to acquire more traditional lands and leveraging the core population of Pamunkey citizens for implementation were paramount to successful adaptation, such as increasing financial resources and federal involvement, specifically from the EPA and FEMA, were noted in the participants' responses. And forming a flood management and planning committee on the reservation was seen to be a good start. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And I appreciate you sharing the details through this story map. As we mentioned, we will be pulling questions from both the Q&A and the chat. We're going to go ahead and open up for questions now. So please use either. And again, for questions that we're unable to get to, and for questions that are specific to Kelly, who had the recorded presentation, we will make sure that we follow up and get the answers to those questions and post those on our website. So I'm going to go ahead and pull a couple questions here for Brianna to start. And the first, Brianna, is can you elaborate more on any findings on racial disparities in rural, coastal, NC? There have been some other studies on this, and I'd be interested in learning if you found anything more on social vulnerabilities compound these coastal hazards. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. I would first say that social vulnerabilities definitely compound these issues of coastal hazards, and the research that you mentioned in your question is definitely, this is consistent with that research. I'm hesitant to elaborate too much more on the findings on racial disparities because my sample is small now and I'd like to collect, these are big things to say, right? And I'd like to collect more data before I elaborate on the racial disparities. But thus far, yes, I'm seeing that lower income people of color tend to abandon properties and move away at a higher rate than other folks.
Thank you. So let me just follow up. You have so many good questions here. From the slide regarding people that stopped carrying insurance and didn't view flooding as a problem while standing in water in their homes, is this an example of a shifting baseline?
Definitely. I would, from my experience in the field, people get used to something. We're very adaptive as humans. You get used to things that you're dealing with every day. And I would say there's a shifted baseline for how much water people are willing to tolerate and how often they're willing to pump water out of their yard, how often they're willing to drive through water. I do think that's changing because the amounts of flooding and the amounts of nuisance flooding are just much higher than they have been in the past.
Great, thank you. This one's for Nicole. Were you able to determine any reasons why participants preferred bulkheads over other barrier types to mitigate flooding? Nicole, you're on mute.
I got it. So there was an overall interest in learning more about what many of these structural mitigation options would really do in terms of stopping sea level rise. And so it wasn't articulated by any particular participant why those were the options they were favoring. But if you look at the literature, Gomez and Bagman did a study that shows that often traditional ecological knowledge gets hybridized with some of the modern practices that are being learned. And so it appears that that's exactly what's happening here, is that some of the traditional priorities are merging, in fact, with some of the newer technologies that are available. So that's not unique to this particular tribe.
Great, thank you. And this is a follow-up question for you, Nicole, or rather a separate but related question. Do you have suggestions for how we can better integrate considerations regarding cultural assets, as well as considerations around land rights, into risk assessments on or with reservations?
Sure. So one of the pieces that were really important to these participants was that there are planning documents surrounding the reservation, but because the reservation is its own government, this is a state and federally recognized tribe, they're not actually included in the recommendations that are made for, say, the county that's right next to them. And they're interested in collaborating and being a part of that process. And I'm sure there would still be an independent piece to that because the council operates separately. But there was definitely a goal of becoming more communicative in terms of how the effects of county and state and even federal action was impacting the tribes. They've used that kind of communication before to prevent dams from going in. For example, one was desired about 3 miles upstream from them, which would have caused really serious problems. And they were so well connected at that time that they didn't have to be federally recognized to get that stopped. So they want some more of that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. This question is back to Brianna. Homeowners are known to be driven to participate in resilient and sustainable green building construction action activities because of scientific findings of improved environmental health and safety and the resultant measurable human performance. Do you think, or do homeowners think, that impacts from flooding have adverse impacts on their homes, specifically to their building materials that may adversely impact their environmental health and safety? There's a little bit of follow-up, but I'll let you take that first part.
This is a great question. Thank you for bringing our attention to health. I didn't ask specific questions about health impacts. However, it did often come up in interviews, not in a formal way that residents or homeowners had trainings, for example, on the potential health impacts of flooding or water damage, but more there was just colloquial knowledge that if you let water sit in your home, you will get mold and mildew, and that is terrible for your health. So there is a lot of attention to getting the water out as soon as possible, mopping out as soon as the water comes in, ripping out carpet or changing insulation underneath the house is a priority to avoid mold and mildew in the home. That's the main thing that I saw.
Thank you. This is a follow-up to this this sort of broader question about the health and safety. Are there educational flooding impact materials that are specifically available from SME agency, US EPA, building science, CDC, et cetera, to educate homeowners on the specific adverse impacts of flooding for the destruction to property and suffering, illness, and damage to humans, in your knowledge?
There are materials available. No one's referenced reading them, but they're available. So how do we get those materials into people's hands might be is a different question, but I do know that agencies and local governments and the state does a lot of work to kind of educate about the hazards of flooding to homes and to health.
Great. And I'm just looking through some of these additional questions and comments. And I just wanted to highlight that there's a comment. I'm so glad to see the type of qualitative or storytelling project coming from ODU and focusing on an Indigenous population. I grew up near ODU and didn't know that they were doing research beyond title readings and the like. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
So ODU has several centers that have been recently funded. I mentioned the CCRFR earlier in terms of developing that map for us, but there's also an Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Research that just started a few years ago and just has a new director as of about a month ago. So hopefully there's more exciting qualitative work coming out of that.
Great, thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. Again, any questions that didn't get answered, we will address those. So this is for Brianna. I worked during Hurricane Florence near the New Bern, and I noticed the racial divide in regards to preparedness and education. All services were available for everyone, but because of a lack of knowledge and involvement, the minorities and immigrants received less. Did you make the same observation?
Emilio, thank you for that question. I can't specifically speak to immigrant communities, though I typically work with immigrant communities, but did not for this project. COVID made it very hard. You have to change things around with COVID, but I can speak to African-American residents. And I also wasn't doing disaster recovery work. I was looking at the everyday impacts and adaptations to slow climate hazards. So this is a little bit different of a context. And I'm not going to say there's a lack of involvement, but I will say that these are rural areas. And it was clear that some communities just had a different kind of baseline understanding of how to access these services and programs than others. And I don't think I know enough about that yet to say why, but I can definitely say that there is a difference. And I have lots of information and interviews of African-American residents approaching officials and trying to apply for funds and finding out things like, well, the water buckled my floorboards and came up, but it wasn't on top of my floorboards, so I didn't qualify for assistance, and situations like that. And I think maybe that's a lack of information or understanding, or maybe it's a fact that, maybe it's attributed to our policies being about disaster, post-disaster storm recovery and not chronic flooding that buckles your floorboards. It's hard to say.
Great, well, thank you. I'm going to go ahead now and share just a few slides here. So again, I just want to thank you, all of you, including Kelly, who couldn't be with us, for sharing this important work. We also want to thank very much FEMA and the National Science Foundation for making this webinar series possible. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. I have just a few brief announcements. So first, please access our website to learn more about the research today. As I mentioned, you can access the research reports and the briefs to learn more about each of the presenters' work here today. And also, please remember to contact us at hazctr@colorado.edu if you plan to earn 1 contact hour towards your CEUs for emergency management and training certification through the IAEM. Finally, I just want to say that I hope that you all will join us for our next exciting Making Mitigation Work webinar series for April, Implementing Mitigation Near and Far, US States, New Zealand, and Applied Research with Gavin Smith. So for now, on behalf of the entire team of the Natural Hazards Center, we want to again thank all of the panelists and all of the participants for joining us today.